I'll always show a few glyphs. You've seen some of those by now, quite a bit. Say, like when we discussed the interior data indicator, EUT, that had happened. This is the E sign. A T is actually a feather of, like on the forehead of a bird. Can anyone guess what kind of bird it is? A vulture. Yeah, it's all very wrinkly. There's a separate glyph for a different kind of vulture. This is T from Tiu, and there's also Ushich, another term for vulture. Yeah, that's the thing, right? That's the thing that the vulture has on the forehead. Uh, and this is a sign of He, one of the two He signs. There's a paw sign He that you'll see in the video recording from Monday. And then this one is like a brackets. Sometimes there are three brackets, sometimes there are four. And this is a common conflation of two bracket-like signs, Ya and He, because it's just some very common spelling in the hieroglyphic inscriptions. Hiya, for He. So these are useful characters. These are frequent characters. I even used T as one of the examples early on in auto T spellings in my catalog, and when we discussed spelling rules. Um, there's so many cases, and this sign is also used as a base glyph for one of the variants of the sign Ahau, like Lord Vulture, like King Vulture. Effectively, that's how they imagine king vultures. And of course, they have king vultures in the Maya area. So we'll talk about bodies and we'll talk about names. Names and bodies are, of course, connected. In my culture, in our culture, it's about who we are, how we represent ourselves. These are some of the basic terms which comprise ba, like self-representation, self, or baha, or bahis, of a Maya person, right? Your nose, and in fact, the sign ni represents hair growing out of someone's nose. So the full form of the glyph ni is actually a nose with like very long hair and bits of boogers, I guess, on it. And then ut or hut is eye, but can also mean face in general. Uchan, front, has an overlapping meaning. In some Mayan language, it actually means face and front. But not in the language of my hieroglyphs. Hol is head, like more anatomically versus ba, because ba is top principle, and but also this notion of self and self-representation. And then you have obviously penis, at. Terms like ok and ab, they cover the whole extremity. And so when you want to say part, you would probably say something like the top of the cup, the bottom of the cup, the tip of the cup. But there are no like specific terms like hand or joint or an elbow that the descriptions have. Instead, you kind of classify the where on an ok or where on a cub you are, and then pat is back, tahan is chest. Now, this is sort of the physical body, like what you see, right? But of course, for a Maya person, that body is a vessel or a point of intersection of various animistic entities, or we would say animistic um, centers, and basically energies, right? They all are concentrated inside someone's ba. And there are different kinds of animistic entities that all of us have. And you can see I am writing some of them with the term is. Do you remember why I'm doing it when they're not possessed? Like ohlis, bahis, wahis.
That's like the disembodied, right?
Exactly. So, because these are examples, they're not possessed here, so I have to put is, right? And so olis is heart, but it's not the physical heart. It's what gives you emotion. Like when you're sad or happy, it's what the all is. That is kind of a soul, a variety of a soul that is in you that gives you that emotion, and it grows with happiness. It gets bigger, and we also know that from hieroglyphic inscriptions. So I guess it gets smaller if you're sad, it gets bigger when you're happy. Bahis, presumably it's associated with head, but it's an animistic entity. Because head, biological head, is hol, right? And this is something else. Wais is it lives in your heart, and these are spells, so these are demons or sort of primordial energies, because sometimes they can be winds and fires, and they usually stay in families. but they're part of you as well. Now, in addition to those, these are entities which are part of you while you live. Sak ik, literally white wind, white breath, that's your basically life force. It expires kai upon your death. The other thing that expires is fiery spirit, akmihin, and seed, sak or shak. And those two entities, they also stay in you as you live, but they continue after your death, and they also continue in your children. So your children are this to you. Like they are your spirit, they are your seed. Kind of makes sense, right? They live in us. I mean, we live in our children. The children, basically our continuation. But these things, they also exist apart as kind of luminous, shiny entities in the sky where they merge with the solar and the lunar and stellar deities. And then there are these two energies, at least two energies. Maybe there are more, but those have been talked about most. One is Kuh, which means God, but also means that thing that makes gods. Like in the language of the Star Wars, the Force. But in fact, there are two kinds of Force-like energy that hieroglyphic inscriptions mention. One is Kuh, and the other one is Kawil, like lightning. And lightning it gets charged into things the same way as Kuh does, mostly through blood. So you need to give blood or take blood to move Kuh and Kawil around. So your body is basically all these things like the eyes, nose, ears, but then within it, there are all these things. And they all have volition, which I think is also interesting, right? You can be pulled by your Kuh. You can be pulled by your will. Like will is the ancestral energy, it's the will of your ancestors. Kuh is your connection to the divine, the gods that possess you. These are your parents too. This is your living essence. They're actually gods of the heart. We have no idea what makes them different from like the Kuh that is somewhere else in your body. But it's very important that when Maya think about body, they imagine a kind of committee. Like we are not singular beings. We're not like atomized. And it's interesting, some of these entities, they extend beyond us, say, into our social world. Like, for example, Vais would be shared with the family, right? Gods are sometimes shared between multiple people. So we don't necessarily think of us as there are these boundaries around ourselves, which are impermeable. Like, we want something that's us. Maya think that their self kind of extends, blends into other social groups, their family group, their kingdom, their gods, and they're constantly in contact. They're sort of we are just an intersection of these things. So they inherently assume that the identity is fluid, constructed, and sometimes hard to understand. They don't try to understand you. They want to see what you're doing. A very interesting assumption of how you judge people. You judge them by what they do. You don't analyze motives because there's just too much stuff there. There's no way to know, basically. You just assume that. So this is a person dying. You can see he's wrapped in a bundle, and there's a glyph kai to expire, and actually see his soul, his fiery spirit, akmihin, going up and becoming sun and moon in the blazing rays of light shown here as centipedes. So that's basically rebirth. But you can also see his body here inside a pyramid, presumably in a grave, right, turned into a skeleton. Then he also continues as a tree, here probably evoking his children, right? His rebirth in a different form, right? In a different way. So if you ask, like, did Maya believe in life after death? It would be like a silly question because, well, they thought that part of you continues, but it continues in different ways. And at no point in time would there ever be anything like you again, right? Because all of these animistic entities or centers, they will never be reassembled in the same composition. So it's kind of hard to understand sometimes what's going on, right? We already talked about it, like what is Baha, what is Bahis, what is whole? Like this is more like Baha, almost certain, like an image. But is it just a head or more of a essence of a person, which would be bahis. For us, it's hard to understand because obviously we're outside of that culture, looking from a great distance in space and in time, and from a very different cultural background. Maya people do carry trophy heads around, suggesting that they are capturing their enemy souls within the head, right? Very much like South American trophy head. Like I took this photo in the Museo de las Américas in Madrid. And these are very similar objects that we see worn by Maya rulers. Those are presumably their captives whose souls they captured. Or I mean, part of their souls, right? Not all. The bahis, presumably, of their enemies. In this way. If you're a Maya person, you're supposed to be beautiful. And it's interesting because their notion of beauty is not like ours. You will never see like hyper-masculine people. Like no muscles, no broad chests. You're just supposed to be fit, androgynous. There's almost no way to tell man versus woman in my art because their standard of beauty is corn. Corn is bisexual. But you're not supposed to have, like, you're not supposed to be skinny, but you're not supposed to be too fatty. Like, you're just supposed to be like a baby with some, like, the baby fat on you, right? You're supposed to be luminous, smooth, shiny, like a corn cob. Yeah.
Like their ideas of beauty and stuff and notions were very like similar for both sexes. Was like sexuality also very similar, or
That's a very good point, and it's fair to say that we do have this idea of sharp separation of uh, gender roles. With respect to sexuality, it's much harder to say because we have no information. But the notion of sexuality was certainly different because what young people did from the historic accounts uh, and what married people did was very different. So encounters which we probably describe as bisexual were normal for people of certain age and category. While then you become married, then it's a different story. Uh, but many images of say Maya ritual acts they appear homoerotic, and it seems that their notion of sexuality was quite different from ours. But what is probably important in terms of how Maya represent body and self is that ultimately it's all about control, which is also interesting. So I'll get there a little later. So you see these people, right, and they're all beautiful, and they're all basically androgynous, right? It's hard to tell whether it's a woman or a man, mostly from dress. Like dress clearly marks people of certain gender, but not in terms of external beauty features. They're all supposed to be very similar. Uh, Smooth, shiny, and of course gods are additionally marked with like marks of shininess. Like they have luminous bodies. Their bodies like shine like crystal. The celestial messenger, like with wings and beautiful shiny body, arrives from the sky. This is the god of maize, shines. Um, the only people who are shown realistically are captives, because they lose the spiritual component of their lives and they lose part of their humanity. They're being shown the way they are, and suddenly you see people with cellulitis, skinny people, bearded people. You also see emotion, and that's something very important. You're supposed to be in control. Yeah, and yes, occasionally we see people also like this fellow from Motul de San Jose, the ruler of Motul de San Jose, who obviously has a little extra fat on his body and is not doing a lot of sports apparently. There are probably quite a few people like that in Maya art. In reality, in like the life of Maya, but not shown that way. And for us, it's hard to tell like why this particular Yahaute Inicho of the kingdom of Ica chose to be shown that way. Was it his personal decision? Different tradition at his court? It's interesting that his successor seems to be slim, and his predecessor is slim. So maybe it's a really kind of personal choice. What we also see in Maya sort of visual representation of people, there are about 3 primary age categories. This is person, like unique, like average, middle-aged man and woman. If you get older, you become mom, a grandparent, right? And before you reach maturity, you are chok, like a young person. And before that, before you can control your body, you're unen, child. So we all start as unen, or even like seem and infants, fetuses, and then we become unen. And then we learn to control ourselves, so we become chok. And it's important that you can die in that stage. Like you may not necessarily reach maturity of a person or of a mom, right? It's about social age, not necessarily biological age. Old age, there's this ambiguity because we see these old gods, creator goddesses, creator gods, the moms, the memes. They're all itsams, they're all sorcerers, and they have power. But then occasionally they're depicted as corrupt, right? This old god, Itsamats, is surrounded by young women. Perhaps, well, one of my mentors, Steve Housen, suggests that these are actually ancient Maya sex workers because they all have the same title in this text. But that's perhaps a wild speculation on his part. But it's important that this god is then, humiliated. All of his stuff is taken from him. You see the young and beautiful maize god giving him a kick in the butt while stripping him naked of his magical clothing and possessions. So there's this idea that as an older generation, you have to be dignified somehow, or things would be taken away from you by younger gods. There is this age-related tension apparent when you look at Maya mythology as evidenced in classic period images. And it's interesting that the old king of gods, Yash Nachritzamko sometimes he's shown as this elderly ruler who is cheated upon by his spouse, who is vanquished by young hero twins, but then he's also sometimes shown as a young, beautiful lord at his prime. And that, I think, has something to do with this dual nature of power. So the power, it corrupts. Old people can abuse their authority. They can lose the way, yeah.
Something I was just noticing in all of these pictures is that like even like the young and like attractive people they're all like kind of fat.
Well, they're not. They're supposed to be like smooth, like a plant, right? You're not supposed to show like leanness. Yes, that's this idea of what a proper healthy look is like, right?
There's nothing I know like old Roman statues, they're like shredded, they're like abs and stuff.
No, that's very interesting. So we're looking here at a different idea what beautiful is. Yeah. Oh, they have cranial deformation. Oh, sorry. Oh yes. So they basically, yes, they flatten their skulls so that they could look like a corn cob in the profile, right? So they'll have nice elongated heads, and then they would shave them so that they would be like a nice corn husk like thing at the end. You can kind of see what he looks like, right? His head is shaved. That's the maize god, right? And you see even these captives, right? They all basically have their hairs in the back and like shaven part of their foreheads is shaved, and sometimes the back of the heads would also be shaved, so that you essentially look like a corn. Like you see this fellow here, right? He's got only like a little husk of hair in the back. Yeah. No, that's not true. Although Diego de Landa mentions in Relación de las Cosas de Yucatan that was done, but it's not clear the extent to which the practice was common, not definitely in the classic period. But it's true that the idea of beauty was very much centered on corn. You want your heads to be basically cob-like. Because yeah, that's the center of their world. It's a corn, but there's nothing more beautiful than a nice, tall corn plant with like corn cobs on it. So you want to look like it. Um, Captives, on the other hand, as we see this notion of loss of control, seems to be very important. In general, no emotion is depicted in my art, and that's when we return to the subject of sexuality and emotion, right? But captives are allowed to suffer. Captives are allowed to look like animals, and that seems to be like the opposite side of like dignity, in my art, you don't want to show your enemies as dignified, because otherwise you shouldn't attack and kill them in the first place. And so babies and captives are depicted the same way. And of course, captives also would often have exaggerated genitalia, sort of emphasizing that they're no longer human, they're no longer in control. So being in control is very, very important in my art. But captives are not. And actually, some of the best depictions of human body that we have in my art are of captives, which actually allowed to show them the way they are, right? Like their emotion, their suffering. That's where Maya artists are at their best. Captives, of course, called Bog. They lose their humanity. They become bones, like trophy bones or accounting bones. This fellow is tied to a rack, like a deer, and right now they're burning him with torches, and then they're going to spear him to death. But this idea of transformation into a sacrificial animal, into to something that is no longer human, is very important to the Maya. The reason why they're doing it is because in a society where there's so much emphasis on personal dignity and control, this kind of notion of how the reversal happens is very important. It's not enough to kill or defeat your enemy. You really have to prove that your enemy is not worth it, that your enemy doesn't deserve to be a winner, right? That your enemy was somehow inferior. So you would, kill and torture, or rather torture first, kill later, to prove your point. And a lot of cultural expression is centered on this notion of control, down to very small, very superficially insignificant details. Think dental inlays, right? Adults can have dental inlays in my culture. You decorate your teeth with pieces of jade. That is done by gradually drilling that piece into your tooth without killing the tooth. So your root canal remains intact. And you just can only imagine how painful that must be. And you're supposed to just stay still, let it happen. And so every time you smile, people can see how tough you are. It's like scarification or tattoos. Yeah, this is the purpose of these things. They show that you are in control of your pain. And of course, these people do incredibly painful rituals too, such as bloodletting, both men and women. And this idea that you're constantly in control. So affect, like raw emotion of any kind, is very hard to find. Like these are scenes of mourning, so I guess those moments are appropriate. So you see people crying, people being sad. This, of course, is a Maya expression of sadness. It's a hieroglyph for sadness that we see in the codices, Nob, most likely, sadness. But most Maya people are not like that. You will not see anything, pretty much any emotion expressed in Maya art, unless you're a captive or a child, or in this extreme effect, like mourning for someone. And those conditions of mourning, sometimes we can see them archaeologically. So you're missing a person badly. During those funeral rituals, people would chop their fingers off. And as archaeologists, we would see bowls with these finger offerings in someone's grave. And usually it would be like a single phalanx, but sometimes there would be like two, and sometimes there'll be three. So there are these ways to express extreme emotion of pain and loss. And some of these ways are very obvious. But overall, you're supposed to be in control. That's what separates you from non-humans. And the idea that this is a gradual process. You gradually become human. You gradually become capable of controlling yourself. So all these people are basically incredibly tough. As part of being in the Maya world, I guess the higher you are probably in the social hierarchy, the more you're supposed to be in control of what you do, what you say, how you hold yourself. Even in today's Maya communities, I remember reading Vogue's ethnographies about Sinakantan, and their local Maya observers would comment that Americans walk in a very strange way. They always look like they're about to fall. And that's interesting because it's really like, I walk that way, right? I walk these big strides, and I allow my body to look unbalanced as I walk. And apparently that's not okay. You're supposed to be always in control, always balanced as you walk, as you stand, as you sit, if you're an adult, of course, or if you already know your way. Same thing with expressions of emotions. They would say that their American students and visiting scholars, they look a bit like animals because there's so much like licking and weird, like they do things like kissing, things that dogs do basically amongst themselves. This also is not happening in traditional Maya communities. People are supposed to be much more restrained in public. So here we're looking at a scene of a reception. It's very interesting because everything is measured through the body, the positions of bodies. Uh, this is like a language, and sometimes we would call it the language of proxemics in terms of where and who is located and what that signifies. The ruler is at the center and to the right. His family is to the right of the ruler. Guests are to the left. Inferior people are spatially down. And in fact, a scholar, Joel Palka, once wrote this excellent article in '96 about the significance of this right hand, left hand symbolism. Sometimes it becomes intentionally subverted. Like in this case, this is the protagonist. This is the lintel of the house, of the palace of this person. So he's to the right, and his king is to the left, but the king is higher. And they also made the glyphs of the king's name to go in the opposite direction from right to left. You can see that they're all looking right, sort of highlighting that from the perspective of this person, the king is still to the right of him. Right? So our attention travels to the right, but then the glyphs and the position of the king do show that the king is still on top. And the captives, of course, are at the bottom and to the left, so where they should be. So this kind of visual language. I already looked at some of these terms, and in the video of the lecture that I did on Monday, I talked about simple adjectives like left, right. These are actual Maya titles, left hand, right hand, presumably in relation to the body of the king, right? And I assume that you're to the left of the king. If you're his right hand, I guess you're facing left when somebody receives you. But I guess if you're left hand, you're presumably the household of the king. If you're right hand, you're in charge of the external relations. And sometimes people call it left hand, right hand, assuming, I guess, there's kind of double role in a courtly initiation. But it's interesting because obviously left hand, right hand is not in relation to your hands, but the hands of the ruler. So the political world is centered around the body of the sovereign, which of course takes us to the names and the identity and how these things are described in Maya writing, like what can be named. And it's interesting because we live in this world of animistic entities. A lot of things have names, indicating that they have souls, right? Very much like not just humans. And this is a Maya glyph for name, which shows you a precious stone, a shining precious stone, the same element as we see in the glyph for God, Kuch. And this alone is a glyph for lamp or crystal, a precious object, inside a bundle. So today, a Maya person would look at this and say, well, this looks like a holy bundle to me, like objects of a great sacred value that you wrap in the bundles and reveal from time to time. And that's important because it shows that this is what a name is, right? It's the essence. It's like your holy bundle. It informs about your true nature. So this is the name of a monument. So monuments, they actually have souls, they have names, because they're put in the ground to help sustain the universe. This monument, it says I Tzapacha. This is the same I we started with at the beginning of the class, but slightly earlier variety of the letter. I Tzapach, Shok, Tun or Kab, Nal, Lem. U Kaba. Here the celt is replaced by a regular U sign, the conflation. U Kaba, U Lakam, Tun Ni. So shark, stone, or earth, place, celt. It is the name of his stela, big rock, Lakam Tun. So monuments, we know from these descriptions that monuments are actually like those little jade X's, which used to be offered in earlier times of my history in pre-classic And so at some point they decided that they would make larger versions of them, put them upright into the ground. And sometimes they would be decorated with images of kings and gods, but ultimately they're still those little grain cells. Um, so each of the monuments, sometimes the monument would have two names. Like this is the monument and this is its name, and it is the representation of something, like a god or a king. That would be like his second name. Buildings have names too. This is a lintel from the entrance of a palace at the site of Yashchalan. And it says, fire entered Ochikak, and then this is the name of the building. Three something sky. Ukaba Yotot, it is the name of her dwelling, then the name of the queen, Ishak Biyan. And it's interesting that it says, this is the dwelling of the king, it is the land, it is the this is the dwelling of the queen, it is the land, it is the city of the king. Kind of clarifying, right? That it still belongs to the king, in the broader context, but this is the queen's palace. Gods, of course, have names, and sometimes my inscriptions even specified. So this is the fire of Yash feathered wheel. It is the name of this god, says the text. Ukak Yash uku awil ukabak uch. So this is not just any general god of lightning. This is the green feathered or green blue feathered lightning. It is its name. This one presumably continues a text that described the building. It says Ukaba Yushul Ah Pachan or Patan. This is the name of the carving of Ahpachan or Patan. It is his name, the wise man. So here we have the name of the monument and the name of the person who carved it, the wise man. So they both have names. They both have souls. Of course, each name would have a personal and social aspects, right? You can call me Professor Tukavinin. Professor is my role, my social self, right? Alex is my personal name. Tukavinin is my surname. This is a rare example when you have Yash Siyak Chan Chak, first something born out of the sky Chag, Bak Uch, principle among gods, Uk Abba, or principle who serves the gods, Uk Abba, it is the name of young nobleman first on earth. So here, young nobleman first on earth is presumably, well, the social role, and then this is his personal name, though it's pretty fancy. It's a prince of some sort, and with some kind of head priest, head god title. But it's interesting that the Ukaba here separates the two parts, the social and the personal. Name reflects life events. So if you're a Maya person, if you're a noble birth, your name actually changes with different life events. So you start out with Okaba, youth name, or unripe name. And you may actually die with that name too, right? If nothing else happens in your life. But ideally, say if you're a prince and you become a king, then you get a second name. So in addition to Chok Kaba, you get Uk al Hunil Kaba, literally headband binding name, so a coronation name or accession name. And that would be the name of which reflects your dynastic sort of name pattern. Each dynasty has its own famous name. Sometimes you'd be named after your father. Sometimes you'd be named after a more distant ancestor. The dynasty of Palenque, famously, they decided to go backwards with their names. And curiously, the dynasty collapsed when they went back to the name of the founder, as if they ran out of the names, and the stress of that, the deciding what to do, was too much. But that's just a rather unusual explanation of a political collapse, running out of the names. But here we have Inich Kan Hoichitam is the accession name, Kanhunikaba, of ball-playing sorcerer, Pitzil Waiwal, Holy Matwil Lord, Holy Bakal Lord. So, Holy Bakal Lord, Holy Matwil Lord, those are social names, right? Titles, as we would say, as well as the ball-playing sorcerer. I guess he was There was some football magic there. He was famous for. And then this is his accession name, which is a repetition of some of the names of previous kings. So he's not the first Hoichitam in the dynasty. We know that when you die, a Maya king, you may also get a second name. So like reflecting your role in the afterlife. So Nunu Holchak, Nun is a problematic gloss, probably mute or perhaps silent or rapt. But then you have Hol, the head of Chak. So Nun is the head of Chak. So that's his main accession name. When he dies, he becomes Ahom Ahan Kawil, priest, maize cob, Kawil. So he becomes a kind of Kawil, a kind of liking, which is a common designation for ancestors, and a particular maize god. And he's also a sacrificial priest, a priest who does sacrifices, Chahom. So those are presumably things he continues doing in afterlife, and that is reflected in his name. So post-death name. So this idea of transformation is important. I already showed you that picture, right? Some of you goes up into the sky, some of you sprouts up. We see ancestors sometimes like looking down, right? They're like still at 31 from the skies, usually merged with the sun. And it's described as upahilian, literally the image of essence. So you kind of become one with celestial beings when your fiery spirit ascends to the sky. I like this scene. You see a king offering his blood on an altar, and his mom and dad are in the sky looking after him. And this is his dad. And the text says that he is of Five Flower Mountain, this special place, kind of other dimension, the place of flowers. Many Mesoamerican cultures believed that this other world is here with us. We just don't see it. And it's described as a place of loud noises and bright colors, like the flowery world, the smell of flowers. So you can kind of look through it as if it were a veil. And so this place of Five Flowery Mountains is sometimes shown in my art as a place surrounded by flowers. And that's where the ancestors are. And then it continues strangely with something that looks like Kosho, maybe like a Kosh pheasant. Like his ancestor became like a beautiful bird in that place of flowers after death. So this kind of transformation. Name is so important that there is a class of monuments called name stones. So when you die and you cross over, you get a name stone. And presumably that name stone reflects your essence, and it allows your descendants to give you offerings, to mention you. So like in our culture, mentioning is very important, remembering. You want to be remembered. You want your name to be remembered. And so they have name stones. Other parts of what the text on the name stone tells are probably not as important as just naming. Very much like Chinese ancestral funeral monuments. There's the same idea that the cult requires naming and memory. So that builds the connection between the ancestral spirit and the living descendants. So it says, Abai uk abatunil ish hishwitz ahau. It is dedicated to the name stone of Lady Hishwit's Lord. In this case, it's the princess from Hishwitz. Names can be pretty long. A lot of our royal names are what we would call name phrases. There is this GRE level word called theophoric. Have you ever heard of it? Theophoric names. Theophoric. There's a term theonym. Yeah, so theonym is like basically God's name, like gods have theonyms. Theophoric is the name that evokes the divine. Like you're not God, you're just mentioning God. Of course, with Maya, it's much harder to understand whether they mean that the God dwells in the person or they're simply evoking something divine by using that name. This person is Kachtili Uchan, and he's literally wearing it in his headdress, as if he were an embodiment of Chak. This is an example of a full royal name, both personal and social aspects. That whole thing is just one name. Because, of course, if you're a king and you rule, your name gets longer and longer and longer. You add additional titles. This is the main part, Yashun Balam, lovely Katinga Jaguar. Lovely Katinga is just the name of the bird. Nice Quetzal-like bird. And if you translate the whole thing, the initial part is his youth name that he had as a young man, and it evokes one god. Unfortunately, we don't know how to read one part of it, but it's a god of sacrifice. Then he became Yashun Balam. That's his accession name. He captured a lot of people in battle. He's a mighty warrior, so he is one of 20 bones, one of 20 captives. Then you have the guardian of Ahuk, the guardian of something. Unfortunately, that name here remains undeciphered, but it's something more, something macaw. So that means he captured at least two prominent people. And in fact, the first one was one of his major campaigns, which he kind of scheduled to just before his accession, as it was customary among Yashoan kings, to do a military campaign to show your ability as a warrior before you declare yourself king. And so those two individuals apparently mark major military triumph, which was very important at Yashchan. It's a militant kingdom that rose basically through conflict. And so their kings basically always show themselves as mighty warriors, personally mighty warriors. And then you have three cartoon and a title that remains undeciphered here, perhaps a singer, it's an unusual combination. And then he's a three cartoon military captain, Yahaute, which makes sense, literally vassal of the spear. And then he is three cartoon lord, and then he is the holy lord of Kach, the holy lord of Pachan. Kach and Pachan are the two place names associated with the kingdom. Pachan is the actual name of the city. Kach is a legendary place name they also trace themselves to. West Kalomte, like a mighty overlord of the West. They claim western part of the Maya world, like they're the overlords. It's kind of slightly aspirational. So all of that is his name, right? Even though it contains more and less important parts. And that's the royal name. Now, a lot of people in the Maya world didn't have names which were that long. And in fact, when we look at commoners, they would have names like Snake Jaguar, and even some kings in the west of the Maya world would have relatively simple names. Or Turtle, Celestial Turtle Crocodile. Some of these names may also evoke supernatural entities, like the crocodile that floats in the waters of creation. Yeah.
Were these names like spiritual sounds well together, or were they like perfectly like, meanings that go together for the form picture? Like,
I don't know. I think they were meant to sound fine, like Kanbalam, you can pronounce it. Ahin Chanak, a lot of them, they ring. And it's rare to see a part of the name that's longer than 2 or 3 words. So they're obviously meant to go well together. And some of the shorter nickname names, nickname-like names, like Achtokti, Flintmouth, they seem to have like specific roles. Like Achtokti was the name of a king in Bowl Game. So you almost kind of wonder whether he really wanted that as a kind of thing people could yell in the bowl court, like Flintmouth, Flintmouth, Tokti. But beyond that, it's hard to say how it actually worked. But say Itzam Kanak is a common name around Piedras Negras. It is actually a name of a city in early colonial times in roughly the same area. So those words, those combinations of words were common in terms of naming places, naming people. This is my favorite animal-based name. Someone didn't know when to stop. Like, don't be like those parents. They ruined someone's life. Right? This person was Jaguar Dia Kinkajou Quetzal Monkey. I don't know how many of you know Kinkajous. Right there. If it was a commentary on his character, then I just don't know what's going on here. About Kinkajous, there's this famous passage from the books of Chalam Balam naming the prophecies of the Katun of 20-year cycles. And there was one that was positive and Towards the end of it, they say, even Kinkajou will not bite. Like things would be so wonderful, so amazing that even Kinkajous would forget their nasty nature. Uh, but both Mash and Wu, those are not particularly nice creatures. Although Kinkajous are cute. Yeah.
So they said that like their captives were like animals and use that like kind of insult. Why don't most of them making animals?
Wow, that's a good question. So you want to be animal in spirit, but you don't want to behave like one. So it's nice to be named after a jaguar, but you don't want to behave like a jaguar. You may remember the jaguar is a bad day. So this is kind of spiritual concept, which is nice to be named after a mighty animal of some sort, or a cunning animal, or a smart animal. But you're not supposed to be like an animal. There's this very big boundary between the human world and the animal world, and we'll talk a little bit more about it when we discuss landscape. So the uncontrolled, wild, nocturnal world that humans try to avoid. Then you have words which are more like names which are more like objects. Jaguars Claw. And this is one of my favorites. Tahom ukaptun. Tahom, something that burns, like searing. Ukab, the hand of stone. The searing hand of rock or stone. And it's the name of some kind of mighty overlord from the west. So this kind of conqueror's name. Like burning stone rod of some kind. And then a lot of them are theonyms or theophoric names evoking particular aspect of the god. Like chalk paints. Apparently we didn't know, but that was a name, chalk paints. A wheel is in the cloudy sky. Uchan, a wheel. Tiliu chanchak. Tiliu makes fire in the sky. Chak is fire. Because still literally means to drill, to burn. So chak burning in the sky is fire. Hashao chan a wheel clears in the sky. Like, I guess, separates the clouds. Like lightning. Chak fills the sky is fire. Chak fills the sky with fire. You can see a lot of these names are about rain gods. A wheel, the living lightning. Chak, the god of rain, and they create loud noises or sounds. Chak is born out of heat or out of mist. In this case, probably not in sun, but even mist. So rain is born out of mist. Bachlach chan a wheel hammers in the sky, and hammering is the sound, right? Like hammer on an anvil. That hammering, not the actual like impact, but the sound of loud noises. Akhoplach chan a wheel, one of my favorites. A wheel extinguishes in the sky is fire. So like when the lightning strikes for a moment, everything seems to be dark, right? The only thing you see is this bright column of light surrounded by total darkness, and that's what like the name apparently tries to evoke. But it's interesting that you have a difference. So some Maya places they have this emphasis on gods and their actions, and yet other places they just name after animals, sometimes with honorific titles. And so the article assigned for today by great scholar, unfortunately passed away very early on, Pierre Robicolas. It analyzes the word kinich, which is the word for the sun god, and when it is used as an honorific title, and when it is used as the name of the god. So to the right are examples when it is used as the name of a god, and it's something along the lines of Ach u hol kinich, the head of the sun god is fire, and there is also a similar name Ach yol kinich, the heart of the sun god is fire. This is Ach at kinich, the penis of the sun god is fire. Someone was named with that unfortunate name. It sounds almost like a health condition, right? And then Yashwanel Chan Kinich, the sun god is eating or perhaps eaten in the sky for the first time. This past summer, my colleague excavated a vase at the site of Church Kitam, and the name of the local ruler mentioned in the inscription is Ahalchan Kinich. The sun awakens in the sky like morning sunshine. It's a nice name, right? You can kind of imagine Ahalchan Kinich. And then these people are Kinich, sun-like in this context because it's used as an adjective, as an attribute. Quetzal jaguar, Ukbalam. Sun-like, snake jaguar. These are relatives from the same dynasty, but that's why they're all jaguars. It's something else. But it's interesting, right? So there's obviously a difference of some sort. And if you plot it on the map, Kinich as an attribute is mostly in the west, and Kinich as a god is mostly in the east, suggesting perhaps different notions of how you interact with gods. Can you be named literally after a god? And these dynasties are also more recent. And that perhaps is another thing. Like these are some of the most ancient families, and they claim a different level of intimacy with gods. And more sort of upstart kings who trace themselves back to just 4th or 5th century, but no more than that. They just cannot claim this connection. So they cannot name themselves after gods because they don't have it in them. That's one possible explanation. Now, in terms of social names, as you can imagine, I'll return to the subject of Maya titles when we discuss courtly life. But these are some of the basic words. I'm just going to go through them. You don't have to learn, just give you a sense of the range of attributes you may have, in addition to your personal name. There are a lot of lords, ahau, right, in Maya text. And the word ahau can also mean a position in society, not just birth, like lordly birth, but say ba ahau, principal lord, is just someone who is in charge of court affairs. Not necessarily a nobleman by birth, not of royal birth. And of course, we already looked at emblem glyphs, a common royal title when you have a place name, here Kanul, and then Kuhul and ahau on top. Kuhul, Kanul, ahau. These parts, Kuhul, are often abbreviated, so you almost never get the lu suffix for Kuhul. And the place name may also lose the place name suffix quite often because these words are so frequent that everyone can recognize what is going on. So the suffixes are frequently dropped in this context. When you don't want to say that someone is a lord, you just say a person from somewhere. In the video, I talk about agentive nouns, and that's one of those. Ach, something. He or she of something. So Petun, Lord from Petun. We have no idea why Petun looks like a bunny. The sign for pe, syllable pe. And this is someone from Petun. So when you want to talk about someone who's not a king, but from the same place, or if you don't want to, you don't agree that that person is a king. Like, that's what you say. Guardian, I already mentioned that title, means basically someone who captured someone. Can you guess what would be the second significance of this term? So if I say, if I captured someone named Tahalmo, I am the guardian of Tahalmo. Uchan, literally the one who oversees Tahalmo. Who do you think would also carry the same title, but in a different social context, with a different significance? Who else would be Chan of someone? Sorry?
A shepherd or a
Parent,
parent?
very close, babysitters. Like those who oversee young people. They're also Uchan. Because captives, they're like babies, right? They're degraded back into the stage of lack of control. So the one who captured them, who keeps them, is their Chan. Right? They're no longer self-sustaining, self-sufficient, like kids. And Uchan people are basically those who oversee, the protectors, the guardians, bodyguards. They're also Uchan, of course, and babysitters. So there you see there's a young boy, and he's doing his first bloodletting. And there is a high priest. They have a title we don't know how to translate. It ends in t, it's all we know. We call them banded bird based on what the glyph looks like, some kind of bird and a headdress. We know they're high-level priests who assist the king in the ceremonies. And they're sometimes royal relatives, like collaterals and junior sons of the royal families. And so there he is. You can see that he's actually holding a stingray spine. So, and then to the right is the Uchan Chok, so the overseer of the young, presumably the babysitter, the gouvernant, or that kind of person, right? And this is one of my favorites. He is shown standing sort of in the corner, and he's smoking a little cigarette. Kind of see, right? His eyes look dark. He seems to be very exhausted. But he's also the most relaxed person in the whole room of the court. It seems like he's seen everything. He's been there. He's like working with kids, right? So we see these people too in my art. And he's Uchan Chok. His personal name is not given in the scene. I guess everybody knows him because he was like everyone's babysitter at some point. And he's the only one that's kind of very informal posture in the whole like courtly arrangement scene when the king is talking to some subordinates and this guy's just smoking in the corner, like what babysitters do, right? Uchan Chok. Generally, youths are called Chak Chok Kelem, and we're not sure how to translate Kelem. It means probably like male, Kerem. There is a gloss. Chak Chok literally mighty youth. So it's very hard to translate because it sounds like mighty youth, or mighty youth, strong man, but evokes your basically strength, your maturity of sorts, and being able to go to battle most likely. A lot of these young men, they're basically the military. A lot of my cups don't mention their owners by name. They just say it belongs to young men. So my mentor, Steve Housen, suggests at some point that they may belong to young people, given them as a gift to mark coming of age. And then you're supposed to pass it on to your kids. And therefore, they don't have personal ownership statements of the usual kind. Sometimes you can be called Ba Chok, and that usually means that you are a heir apparent. So among the princes, you're the head, or you're the first among the princes. So you're going to be the next king. And that seems to, at some of my sites, it certainly seems how it works. Ba Chok, principal young man. And that term Ba generally refers to first among others. And it's very common to indicate positions of authority. So you can be head carver, Ba Ushu. And sometimes we see monuments signed by multiple carvers, but one of them would be Ba, suggesting that he is the head of a workshop, the one who directs the efforts. You'd be called Ba Kap, that's a common royal title, first on earth. But every dynasty is first on earth. It's a little misleading. But it's presumably some kind of position within the ritual hierarchy within the kingdom. So several members of the royal family are usually Ba Kaps. Military commanders, their head spear, head flint, head shield, and then Ba-tam or Ba-tsam is like principal throne or head throne. We know it's a very important administration role, very much like Ba-hao. And sometimes junior members of the royal family have it before they move on to kingship. So it's not uncommon if you're a junior member to have your, say, uncle being the high king, your dad being sort of the junior king, and you're just in charge of those, administrative affairs. And then you expect that one day you'll be king and maybe even high king if you live long enough and don't lose in the internal political games. So these are common titles. Just below the levels of royalty, you also have these additional titles that we'll talk about. Akhunds of priests, Sahals of provincial governors and military leaders who are in charge of secondary cities. Amongst them, there's usually one Basahal. There'll be like a provincial governance head, someone who represents the governors before the king. Some officials are called mouths. So there are usually two mouths at any point in time. Tisakun, who's usually more common in monuments, the mouth of the white headband, and that's the civilian substitute of the king. He speaks for the white crown. When the king is at war, he is wearing the fire crown, Akun, And then the speaker of the crown, of the fire crown, is presumably the king's substitute at war. Like he speaks for the king at war. Um, and then, of course, the princes, Yahauk'a would be someone who reports to the king, and the Tik'akun, like literally the vassal of fire, like of the king's crown, presumably, like a high military priest and commander. And below him, you would have these Yahaute, vassals of spear, or Ba'atoks, Ba'apakals, head shields, head flints, and Ba'ates, the head spears. Those would be like military commanders, and below them, presumably all those jocks looking for jobs and figuring out who amongst themselves is going to survive and become the next king or high-level court official. You may have noticed nearly all of the examples I gave you are male. That's a huge bias that we have with respect to personhood and social status and many other aspects of the classic Maya society. A lot of the inscriptions talk about men. They were carved by men. But it doesn't mean that women are not important. You may remember I've shown you those murals from the site of Calakmul. They seem to be a temple of a market goddess. So economic transactions. It's the only place where they're actually shown in a sort of large scale. And most of the participants are women. Women make textiles in my society. That's the source of wealth, the primary source of wealth. The agriculture in the Maya society doesn't seem to be split along the gender roles the way it is in the colonial times. So women are actually producing and owning property on a same scale as men. We have queens, of course. But it's interesting that female hierarchies are hidden from view. And this seems to be not because they don't exist, but because reporting them on monuments is not appropriate. There are other means of expression, probably through textile, and it just happens that those things didn't get preserved. So we see basically certain things which were common among men, in part because they were on stone. And the choice medium of communication for women was textile, and it just didn't get preserved.
Do you think that potentially like sewing or writing on textile was another common medium for glyphs?
I bet, because we see glyphs at least painted on textile or sewn into textiles. So I bet that was the case. Just we don't have those things. We see female names, and sometimes we see women named after gods, like Lady Chak or Lady Chak eats in the sky, so comparable to male names. We see names with like Lightning Serpent, Lady Lightning Serpent, or Lady White-Feathered Quetzal. These are names from the West, and they seem to be very much comparable to male names from Western Maya kingdoms, which are mostly animals with some divine attributes. There's another pattern of female names which seem to evoke the moon goddess and objects in possession of the moon goddess. So this is a lady, moon-like or moony, it's an adjective. Sky, celt. So lunar, celestial celt. And this is a slightly expanded comparable name. It's Lady Six Sky Loom Celt. Sounds a little weird, but Six Skies is the place where the celestial king of gods lives with his spouse, the moon goddess. And the moon goddess has a loom. And this is the jewel of that loom. Presumably, the thing you move the threads with, but made with a precious stone. So it's the emphasis, of course, is textile production of the moon goddess, of course, who is the patron of textile. Women are the main female title is goddess. It's kind of interesting too. The kings are Kuhul, Ahau, right? Holy Lord, divine Lord. The women are Ishik Kuh, goddess. It's very interesting. They're not holy, they are divine. They're gods, goddesses. Suggesting that in case of the female side of royalty, the divine presence is continuous. Like they're always gods. Probably because they create things, right? They create things all the time. Not like men who can only do it and never fully, right? They cannot create new life. And so queens are goddesses. And some of their names, they seem to be just moon goddesses' names. So they are incarnations of the moon goddess, direct sort of visual manifestation of the moon goddess into this world. There are additional goddesses, though, of which we know very little. For the same reason, right? Because the reporting side, what we see is mostly warfare and kinds of political interactions amongst men. We have very few texts specifically discussing affairs of women, and they're in rare and unusual places. For example, there's a set of plates from the Kiras like brass protector worn by the king of Piedras Negras, which seem to detail his family life. Like he was wearing references to his marriages on his breastplate, like made out of little composite spondylus shells. So each shell contained a reference to his marriages, and we know that those were supervised by his senior wife. So she was deciding whom he was going to marry, and she was overseeing those events, which is also very interesting from deciding how those things were arranged, not by men, it seems, according to those texts. But it's interesting that those inscriptions were not recorded on a monument, right? A highly personal, portable item that survived by pure happenstance. So these are some of the female names and titles. Lady God, so goddess, Lady Rat or Mighty Jaguar, Lady Sahal, Lady Six Stones, that was her name, Waktun, Lady Six Stones, Lady Ika Lord, Lady Bakab, Lady Sacrifice a God Shark, Lady Kabal Shark, like Handy Shark. That's a surname. We know it from the inscriptions of that site. So they all had that name, both men and women. Lady Priestess, Lady Priestess. Lady Kalomte, also here, Lady Kalomte, like Supreme Ruler. So women have exalted titles. Unfortunately, we don't understand how they fit or how the female hierarchies work in the Maya world, because we usually see women just attending to men in certain contexts that men want us to see. We know that women can summon gods, they can talk to gods, that many gods have a gendered counterpart. For example, at the site of Yashchalan, the queen is summoning lightning, so charging herself with Kawil, as the 4 female suns, like 4 suns which are female, 4 stars which are female. Lady Sun, Lady Star. Unfortunately, we have no idea who these goddesses are. It's the only reference in the entire corpus. But they exist, right? So these rituals appear to be less public. So this division seems to be cultural. And it's easy for us to imagine it as a sort of disbalance of power. But it may not necessarily be the case, more like how we interpret it. But because of the unfortunate nature of the available evidence. Finally, I just wanted to say that sometimes names can reveal a little bit about identity, like linguistic or ethnic identity. Usually the titles in a name, the social part of the name, goes in order of importance from left to right. So the most important titles like Bakab and Kalomte, first on earth, High King, would be at the end. That's a common sort of Cholan pattern. But we do get occasionally names which seem to be reversed, where titles go before the personal part of the name. So instead of saying someone Kalomte, you would have Kalomte, and then in this case, Ukit Kanlek. And that seems to be an indication that perhaps the first language of the person is not Cholan. Because in Yucatec, that's how you're supposed to name someone. First you mention the titles, and then you name the person. Or here, priest Yiban. So instead of saying Yiban, the priest Yiban. And it's interesting that these traits in names, they have a greater spatial spread than the specifically Yucatecan linguistic traits, suggesting perhaps we're dealing with a larger population of Yucatecan speakers, but only sort of one core area in which the language is really prominent in sort of the public discourse. You actually see more words. And then there's a larger zone where Cholan dominates the sort of the public sphere of life, the prestigious communication. But people still speak Yucatec, they still have names. And things like syntax in the name betrays sort of the true linguistic substrate of the population. So those names can also serve as these subtle indications of who people actually are, like where the boundaries between different Maya sort of ethnic and language communities are actually located, regardless of what kind of language they choose to write or speak in.